people I think have joined us for the other sessions that we've had today. So this is part of our Practice Educator conference, and this is a key priority for our teaching partnership this year to support practice educators and to really value the vital contribution that they make to social work education. And I'm really, my name's Cheryl Wall. I'm the Partnership Programme Manager, and I'm really pleased to introduce Amanda Fitchett. And you can see from the slide, she's the Assistant Professor and the CPD module lead for Coventry University. So over to you, Amanda.
Good afternoon, everyone. So this session is probably not the most interesting session that people might be attracted to in terms of when we talk about evaluation. Because I know that sometimes when we do courses or anything we do, you know, the thing that catches you all at the end is an evaluation process. But it is, I think, very important to think about how we do quality assure practice learning, how we ensure placements and practice educators quality as part of the overview of what we do for ensuring that there are good quality services for people who use services. Can you change, please? Next. That's it. So what I wanted to start with was explaining a bit about where QAPL came from, because many of you, I've seen some of the names as people have entered, have been familiar with QAPL probably for many years. So QAPL stands for the Quality Assurance in Practice Learning, and was first introduced a long time ago by Skills for Care and others as a method of evaluating practice learning. And what's happened recently is that there's been a review of the QAPL forms, which were somewhat out of date, by BASWA. BASWA holds the QAPL information, but they don't necessarily sort of own it as such. It was developed outside of BASWA in the first place. So this is the third edition of the QAPL framework. And one of the things I wanted to start off by saying is that this new framework has got a lot more forms relating to placements and practice learning in it than previous iterations of QAPL. And the forms include things that you are very familiar with, I'm sure, like, you know, practice learning agreements, midway agreements, and on all of those kind of things. Which was a bit of a surprise to me, because I thought that QAPL was really focused on the evaluation element of practice learning. And I think that QAPL isn't, it's not part of the legislation. We don't have to use QAPL. You can use QAPL or something similar or something you've designed yourselves to evaluate placements, but most people, I think, do use some elements of the QAPL forms. So in this presentation, I'm only really going to look at the evaluation forms, because I think that there's been work in the teaching partnership over the last few years looking at practice curriculum and having perhaps a standard practice curriculum across the teaching partnership, which I think some people have adopted and others have used their own practice curriculum, which have things like already the practice learning forms, practice learning agreement forms, and all of those kind of things in it. So I'm just going to focus on how we quality assure placements. And I hope that's okay. I think it would be very tedious to have a session where we looked at all the different forms, and I promise not to do that. Next slide, please. So let's think about what QAPL is. QAPL provides a quality assurance framework for everybody involved in the planning, the implementation, the monitoring and reviewing of social work placements and practice learning. So that involves a whole range of people: practice educators, employers, universities. in the main, and I'll talk a bit about service user involvement in that a little bit later. So as I said, it's hosted by BASWA, and they have recently revised it. There's the link there if you want to go and look at the QAPL documents yourselves. And just as to remind you that I'm not going to go through all of the forms. In fact, I'm not going to go through any of the forms. You'll be very pleased to know. Next slide, please. So I wanted to start by thinking, well, why do we have to, why do we need to evaluate placements? And I suppose there are lots of reasons, but my main reason, which you'll see in a short while, will be because we need to ensure the best quality social workers that enter the workforce. But equally, there are things that have to be done or have to be demonstrated to Social Work England, for example, because they govern social work courses. And they want to know that we do what's on this slide, which is ensure that placement providers have the necessary policies, procedures, and all of those different kinds of things that you would want to be assured of if you were a student going into a placement. So, you know, procedures in relation to the student's health, well-being, risk, and support systems and everything to underpin those. And this is done by using an audit tool, if you like. And there are two audit forms in the QAPL documents. One is for new placements that have never been used before, which is in Appendix 2. And then there's a review of tried and tested placements that are perhaps regularly used. Now, you may not necessarily as a practice educator have come across these forms. Often agencies do these forms from the staff development or, you know, the people that organise the placements, matching and everything, sort of departments, whatever they might be called. But it has been good practice to have an audit of placements, because what an audit form does is looks at what opportunities are available for the student, to learn various things about whatever area that they happen to be placed in. And it's a tool that helps check that the placement is going to offer sufficient practice learning opportunities for the student to be able to meet the assessment framework. And for most students, that's going to be the PCF, but it might be the apprenticeship standards, or any other sort of standards that placements are being measured by. So one of the things I think that's really important is to think about this audit form as a way of checking, not checking up on anybody and not checking up that the placement it is okay, but making sure that the best possible learning opportunities are available for students. Because by having good quality practice learning opportunities, students are more able to develop a greater width, I suppose, of knowledge, values and skills and things like that. So once an initial placement form has been, a placement audit has been done, then we might want to renew that audit, perhaps on a yearly basis or something, just to check out that the same opportunities, the same health and safety things still stand, and lots of different things like that. And it was very interesting because when COVID hit, I'm sure that many sort of risk assessment and audits were undertaken, not only for the work of social workers, but also, you know, how social work students were going to fit into the sort of new COVID arrangements. And one of the easiest ways perhaps to have done that would have been to have reviewed the QAPL audit form and then changed it as necessary for any COVID requirements that people might need. So overall, when in doing this, we're then so universities are then able to sort of say to Social Work England that we meet this requirement. So a lot of the things that we do around practice and practice learning are driven by other factors, not just the fact that we've decided it's a good idea, which of course it is, but because there are some regulations that we need to ensure that we meet. So when Social Work England come and do their review meetings and things like that at universities, they might well ask to see some of their QAPL audit forms. And they would want to know, if you're not using QAPL, how are you auditing placements to ensure good quality learning opportunities. Next slide, please. So a further piece of guidance then is, and I think this is probably the key piece really from Social Work England, is that we have to ensure that regular and effective monitoring, evaluation and improvement systems are in place, and that these involve employers, people with lived experience and students. But I would also add in there practice educators. I think that that's missing from this particular standard, if you like. And what they suggest is that you could collect it by using the QAPL forms, and they have provided, you know, and there is provision for that. But there's also provision for you not to have to do QAPL. But so when QAPL was first introduced, there were some universities that I remember, unfortunately I was around at the time that the QAPL was introduced, didn't like perhaps the language or the forms. It was very clunky electronic form, and may have made adjustments to that form that they perhaps wouldn't necessarily call a QAPL evaluation form, but they do the same purpose, if you like. And the QAPL forms, so for the quality assurance element of the QAPL document, are found in the appendix 7A and 7B of that document. As I say, I'm not going to go through the document because you can look at that yourselves, and you've probably seen it many times in different forms anyway. But that's where the actual evaluation of the placement forms are sat. Next slide, please. But what I wanted to get us thinking about is not really about forms, which forms we use, what questions we ask, which I think are the lesser important factor. I think that what the most important factor in quality assurance is ensuring that social workers and social work students particularly get a good quality placement, because it has impacts in other ways. So what I wanted to share with you, and many of you have probably seen this before, is the sort of overarching ethos that we use at Coventry University in our postgraduate practice education certificate. So our main ethos is really to enable people with lived experience of social work to receive the best possible assistance from social workers whose knowledge is grounded in theory, whose skills are refined and focused on empowering and enabling the marginalised in society, and whose values reflect a clear understanding of oppression in all its guises. And that is the underpinning ethos that has led me through my whole sort of social work career, both as a social worker and as an educator, because what we want is the best quality social workers we can get, because people who use services deserve that. They deserve the best quality social work intervention, social work what's the word? But they need really good quality social workers. And I think that if we begin to think about QAPL through a lens that focuses on that, then they become less tedious forms that we have to fill in, but more of an important role in ensuring the quality of social work practice. And I think you know, that for me is the way of looking at QAPL really. Next slide, please. So let's start thinking about it then from different people's perspectives. So QAPL's important because we should evaluate placement effectiveness and our agreements with placement providers. So it's important for employers to have some kind of agreement with the university as part of the sort of quality management process. And it's probably best if we all stick to the same process. I don't think it would work if local authorities perhaps were quality assuring their placements with one form and the universities were doing it with another. For one, there would be a lot of duplication, but also if we all stick to one way of doing things, then we're more likely to be more effective in the way that we assure quality. So one of the things we're looking for is identifying any weaknesses or concerns with particular placements. And that might be not necessarily about concerns about a particular practice educator or something. It might just be that the placement itself doesn't provide the opportunities that students need, or needs a bit of help perhaps from another area, another team or something to make it a good enough placement experience for a student. So I think we have to be creative in the way that we look sometimes at placements, rather than having one student placed in one part of the team, but not really getting much experience or exposure to the whole lot of other things that goes on around. And there certainly has been some research and discussion about having a wider placement experience. But what we have to be careful of in that is that the placement doesn't just become something that the student looks on at, because what we're testing out is students' capability through the PCF to actually do things in social work practice. So if we start to spread out placements over a number of services, we can end up with the students doing an awful lot of shadowing, but not an awful lot of doing. So I think that it's important that we have ways in which we can talk to employers, provide feedback to them, and also for them to be able to provide feedback to universities, so that we have this more holistic view, if you like, of the quality assurance process. One of the suggestions is that, when we're viewing placements, we need to consider the quality and quantity of teaching, supervision, I would say also, and assessment provided by practice educators and placement supervisors or on-site supervisors, as you might know them as. By surveying students, and we'll come to that in a little while, but also by surveying practice educators and all the staff sort of involved in supporting the student through their placement journey. Next slide, please. So again, if we begin to look at this through the lens that I was talking about earlier on, that the best quality placements are there to develop the best quality social workers of the future. And I know that's been talked about a bit in some of the other sessions today, that's what practice education's about. It's about developing social workers whose knowledge, values and skills is really sound. But from an employer perspective, the payoff of that is an investment in quality placements provides an ideal opportunity to enhance the quality of newly qualified social workers whose knowledge then and skills and values is sound. So it's a kind of step-by-step process. If we don't provide really good quality placements for students and really good quality practice education, then when they enter the social workforce, they may not be the best quality newly qualified social workers that they could be. And part of the role of a practice educator is to try to strive to ensure that the students are as good as they can be. But of course, they're only beginning students. Beginning social workers at that point. They're entering as a newly qualified social worker, not an experienced social worker who's had 20 years experience. And we need to remember that as practice educators when we're assessing them, and use the language of the PCF framework, for example, that has very different language for a 70-day placement than it does for a 100-day placement. And it's good to look at that and we always encourage that in the Practice Educator course that I run, that you look at what's required for a student at a particular level. Because I think when we're experienced social workers, we can begin to think that all students have to meet that level, and they're just not going to be able to do that because they don't have the practice wisdom to draw on to do so. But coming back to the sort of why it's important for employers, it's a two-way process really, of practice educators and students evaluating the placement, but also the universities providing feedback once they've gathered all the QAPL information from placements into some kind of formal report. They need to be sharing that with employers, so that employers can see where improvements might be needed or where excellence is obvious and could be shared perhaps amongst other people within the organisation. And I think in the past, if I'm honest, I think that the first part of this two-way process has happened, sometimes not all the time, not every placement is evaluated or whatever, but I'm not so sure that the second part of the process happens regularly and in a planned way. The sharing of that QAPL information back with employers so they can review their placements and their practice learning strategy, for example. So I think that there is work to be done, and I know that we have a QAPL sort of group within the teaching partnership who are trying to look at this kind of process a bit more. So it's important that both of those things happen. Next slide, please. So again, why is it so we're moving on now away from employers as such to more individual practice educators, including practice educators in training. So the PEPS, which is the main document and standards that practice educators have to meet when they are learning to be practice educators, but also need to keep up to date with once they're qualified practice educators, has 4 domains to it. And I've just picked out a couple of bits that I think are sort of sit with what we're talking about today. So domain D1 says that practice educators need to seek feedback from students on their experience of being assessed and the consequences of the assessment programme for them. So I think it's important that practice educators hear this feedback and use that as a developmental tool in terms of perhaps looking for CPD opportunities to promote further learning, and also for just sort of self-reflection. But also students aren't just asked about their opinions about practice educators, they're asked about the placement. So they might have something to say about the learning opportunities that are available, or maybe there weren't so many learning opportunities available. And so it's important for practice educators to review placements once they're finished, and also obviously as you go along. And then domain D4 says that, demonstrate critical reflection of your own development as a practice educator, and using the feedback that might be from direct observations if you're perhaps being observed by a mentor or somebody like that, from colleagues or tutors, or other assessment sources. And I think one of the important assessment sources here is the students themselves. Next slide, please. So again, sort of focusing through this lens of an ethos that service users deserve the best quality social work. We have to aim, when we're teaching, say, on practice educator courses, to ensure that practice educators have appropriate practice educator knowledge, practice educator values, and practice educator skills, which are different, but not necessarily entirely unsimilar to social work skills, but it's taking it one step away. So it is important, I think, to think about practice educator knowledge, values and skills as being different. They're beginning to be about the supervision process, about the assessment process, about the induction process, rather than social work processes themselves. And sometimes practice educators in training get a bit muddled up between those two processes, really. And I think that, you know, gaining feedback from students it's an ongoing process, but we have to acknowledge that there's a power imbalance in the relationship between the assessed and the assessor, as Field et al. Say in their Practice Educator book. So I think it's important that we think about power, and we remember that even if we're a trainee practice educator, plus sometimes you don't feel very powerful, but you are, because you hold the decision about whether somebody enters the social work workforce in your hands. Earlier on, I think Neil Thompson was talking about gatekeeping, or it might have been you, Annie, I can't remember. But we know we are the gatekeepers of the profession, and I can't stress that enough, that, you know, our assessment as practice educators needs to be really robust, so that we ensure that that anybody who doesn't have the necessary knowledge, values and skills doesn't get into the social work workforce, because that's not fair on service users. But we have to understand that by getting feedback from students, there's an anxiety about that, especially if their assessment is ongoing. So normally, and I hope that most universities follow this process, that the QAPL evaluation forms go out after the placement assessment decision has been made and the placement's finished. And I think that that's important, because students feel less, or can feel less worried that if they say something negative about you as a practice educator, you're not going to use it against them and fail them. Of course, that'd be very unprofessional, but that's a kind of a fear that students have, that we need to acknowledge, that we do have a position of power. Next slide, please. So thinking about power, then, what I want to do is I want to use some breakout rooms, and I want you to think, as practice educators, how can you alleviate student anxieties about the feedback process? Because although you may have finished the placement, you're still probably, you know, perhaps involved in the student in some way, or communicating with the student in some way. And I thought it would be useful to develop an extra slide that, you know, were I giving this presentation again, that we could put into the presentation that looks at how practice educators look to alleviate anxieties about power and the assessment process. So you're going to be put into breakout rooms very shortly, and I would like you to come back with one or two statements or sentences that you could put in the chat, which will then be saved, and then I can turn into an addition to this document to address that particular issue about student anxiety. And that, you know, I think that we need to think of it not just about all those students who do pass, but also about the students who struggle, or those that fail. So I'm hoping that you'll be able to help me here and give us a sort of a tool that we can use when we try to promote the use of the QAPL forms. So I think Adam or somebody is going to put you in breakout rooms.
Just about to move over now.
Most people are back. So I just wondered whether if I carry on with the presentation, that will give you an opportunity to put comments in the chat, put any statements or anything that you've thought about in your groups into the chat, and I'll pick them up very shortly, if I just carry on for now, and then we'll come back to that, because it'll give you time to do that. And again, you know, it is important that we capture something, because I want to use that material within a similar presentation that can perhaps, you know, be shared with students and things in the future. Next slide, please. So the next group of people then I wanted to look at, we've looked at employers, we've looked at practice educators, is why, you know, QAPL is important for students. Because obviously they're an essential part of the QAPL process, because it's their placement we're evaluating. And I found this in one of my rather old books, where Jonathan Parker states that practice learning opportunities need to be fit for purpose. That is, they need to offer you, the student they're talking about, the learning opportunities to meet the standards and requirements for social work practice. And in many cases, that's the PCF, but it might be the apprenticeship standards or other things. Parker goes on to say it's important that you're able to assess the worth of a learning opportunity. And this is very interesting, this last bit of this sentence, because it's not just for them, but it's for student workers, social workers coming after them. So already students are beginning to enter into that process, not just of evaluating their placement, but of evaluating the practice learning opportunity for others. So they're a vital part of that process. Next slide, please. And again, they're thinking about this from through the lens of a student, that we do need to consider the power, as I've already said. And I think Parker sums this up again quite well, suggesting that it's in the interest of the university, the practice agency, so the employer, the social work profession, and most of all service users, that practice learning prepares students for the for social work practice, and constructive criticism should be welcomed. We shouldn't be shying away from anything that students say in their feedback. Probably perhaps there is a role in perhaps the supervision of practice educators by team managers and things to perhaps look at the evaluation forms and help form some kind of learning from those for practice educators' CPD development, if you like. So students then need to, in order to do this well, rather than just sort of tick the boxes, as I know we're all tempted to do, they need to understand that their feedback can be used in a useful way, both for practice educators and for the placement itself. So I think that that's very important to bear in mind. Next slide, please. Excuse me. So finally, if we're thinking about the ethos that I introduced, that's our course ethos, you'll see the benefit for people with lived experience of social work is in receiving, as I've said many times, the best quality social work assistance that they can. And that remains sort of central to the whole quality assurance process. I think that there can be no doubt that students who receive excellent placements and excellent practice learning opportunities will begin their social work careers sufficiently prepared for entering the profession. And again, I've picked out here just one of the Social Work England education and training standards that says that social work courses deliver, in partnership with practice placement providers, practice learning experiences that support readiness to practice at point of graduation. This includes providing learning opportunities that reflect and allow students to learn from the diversity of the communities they will work with. So again, it's emphasising the importance that there's a sort of partnership going on here. That we need to work together, both universities, employers, practice educators, to give the students that best quality placement that they can have. Next slide, please. There is also a role, I think, for people with lived experience to be involved in feedback to students. but feedback to students falls more into the assessment process and is held within the practice curriculum or the practice portfolio that you're assessing, you know, the student's journey throughout. It doesn't necessarily sit that well in the QAPL evaluation, because it'll be very difficult for people who with lived experience to evaluate a whole placement, because they won't necessarily have been involved in the whole placement. So that's being addressed separately in the conference tomorrow in the session Principles for Gaining Meaningful Feedback from People Who Use Services and Those Who Care for Them. So it isn't that we've left them out, it's just that they don't quite fit into this process because they don't have the holistic view that agencies and practice educators and students have of a whole placement. So it is important, but it comes somewhere else. Next slide, please. So this is so what do we do with all that data? What do we do with all those forms, or what should we be doing? Might be a better question. So quality assurance is, in terms of emphasising the importance of gaining feedback, needs to be used as a sort of implement, if you like, to improve placements for the next cycle of practice learning. So I do think it's important that universities do share the data in some kind of feedback to agencies and practice educators. And I know this doesn't always happen. And I know I've heard a lot of practice educators say, well, I never saw the evaluation forms. And I think this is where the QAPL process needs improving. We need to make sure there's a sort of a full 360 cycle, if you like, of the provision of feedback and then the sharing of that with both practice educators and placements themselves, so that they can, you know, put that cycle of learning, you know, it back into practice, a bit like Kolb's reflective cycle. Really, you can't reflect if you don't see the feedback in the first place. So I do think there are improvements that we could do there. But I do hope that some universities.
You can talk. I'm on mute. I mean,
you're not on mute. So I think that that's important, really, that we do focus on that bit of the process. And I do hope that some universities do share the evaluations and share perhaps a report at the end of that sort of placement cycle process. And if they don't, then that's what we need to be focusing on. Next slide, please. So I think one of the things that I will come back to the feedback in a minute, but I just thought it'd be easier to finish the presentation first. One of the things I wanted to think about was that everyone has a part to play in this QAPL process, and if one person in that process either doesn't complete the forms, or completes them in just a very tick boxy way, without looking through that lens of the best quality social workers that we can have, then I think that it weakens the process. And I kind of compared it to the ingredients, if you like. So students, practice educators, agencies and universities are all the ingredients that goes into the QAPL process. But if we miss out one of those ingredients, then we don't get a whole picture. So if we're making a pie, it won't turn out quite how we'd like it to. And I can certainly think of times when I've substituted an ingredient in a recipe and found that it didn't quite work as it should have done. So we all have a part to play to make this process work and to make it meaningful and useful to everybody. And so I would encourage you, you're part of the ingredients list. The method that we have for cooking or making our pie is the QAPL process, but it needs the right ingredients in it, and the ingredients needs to be good quality. So sometimes if you swap, for example, the butter for margarine in a recipe, it might not necessarily work quite so well. We all know that if you sort of put low-fat spread in instead of butter, it just sort of melts into sort of very runny, watery liquid. And so next slide, please. the end result should be, and I try to sort of find a way of summarising this up, a quality apple pie, which is lovely. So if we think about the QAPL title, and we only end up with that quality apple pie if everybody puts in their ingredients. And I suppose the purpose of the presentation today is to encourage people to engage in that process, to provide their ingredient, if you like, and provide a good quality ingredient to make the process as good as it can be, because ultimately a good process that evaluates placements will have an impact on the quality of placements that social work students receive, and increases the opportunity of their placement being the best placement possible, because that's what service users need. So I hope that that is a useful way of thinking about it. Next slide. So there's space now for comments and things, but I'm also going to go to the chat and see what you've put in there from the exercise that we have. So yes, so things like Andy's put in there, you know, your feedback may help future social work students. And another one here, approach and the use of language, regular supervision and feedback. There shouldn't be any surprises. If you're sharing, that's right, if you've got this good relationship as a practice educator and student, there shouldn't be any surprises that the student writes in their evaluation form, or that you write in yours. That it should have all been shared as part of the process. So I think, yes, that's very good. Felicitas, lovely to see you, one of my current students. Reassurance that learning never stops, you know, and that's quite right. You know, I've been in practice learning now for 20 odd years, far too many, and the learning doesn't stop for me. I still learn things. I still like to come to days like this because I learn a lot from people like you, or the presenters. So it's really important that it's a two-way process. And you know, I think encouraging your student to be open is and feel at ease is just the right thing that you need to do. And then we've got, what else have we got? Within the group, the importance of building a working rapport. That's right. I think that's very important, and giving something of self to highlight that you know, as practice educators, we have anxieties. And that we can all make mistakes and all of those kind of things. And we only develop, as you say quite rightly in that comment, through a process of critical reflection, which we encourage in practice educators, but we should encourage in everybody, really. Yeah, as students embracing their position as learners, they're there to learn. You know, and it's and feedback is an essential part of that process, as it is for practice educators as well, really. So that's really good. Right, open and honest, yeah. Yes, and can see that we try to offer the best possible student placement. It doesn't always go quite right, does it? I've certainly been aware in my practice educator career of there perhaps not being the right kinds of work, just don't come through the door at the right time for the students. So there are always things that perhaps we could improve on. But that doesn't mean to say that they've gone wrong entirely. It just means that there are things that we could think about, really. Yep, everybody sort of, I'm very pleased to see that PE student relationship is critical in the process of being open and honest, isn't it, really? So that's really good. I think I think well, most of the other comments seem to be saying the same thing, really. It could be a standing item on the supervision agenda, I quite agree. Yes, and making sure that there is that process that I've just talked about, that there's feedback going both ways. This isn't just information for universities to gather, it's for universities to share as well. And I think, yes, I think this is important, and maybe this might be raised a bit tomorrow, but, you know, it's even important, you know, where the student has perhaps struggled or there's been issues of failure, and that's different. The quality of the placement is different from the outcome for the student. But I know in the past, having been the course director at Leicester, that actually getting feedback from people who have failed is quite difficult. And I think that also one of the things that is quite difficult is the timing of getting the feedback. And I know that some universities sort of hold the student to ransom almost by saying that they can't pass their placement until this form is completed, and I know that certainly we did that at Leicester, but others who don't do that then often don't get a full set of evaluations. So there's a real balance to be had between doing that. But what I wanted to try to aim with this presentation was to encourage everybody to think through a different lens. And if we think of everything we do in social work practice as being the things that we need to do to help the most marginalised people in society, then we begin to view it from a very different perspective, other than a tedious form that we have to fill in, which I'm sure somebody's probably going to talk about now in terms of evaluating the presentations today. But I hope that's been helpful. If you've got any questions or comments, please feel free to say so. Any comments, anyone? Or are you all tired at the end of the day? Well, if there aren't any questions, I think probably it's time to finish. Right. I hope you have a nice evening and can reflect on some of the discussion today.
Thank you, Amanda. There's lots of thanks in the chat for you as well, and feedback about how helpful it was. So thank you for coming and giving us a new way to think about QAPL as well. I'm going to take the pie analogy with me. That was really good. Thank you. And I think it's refreshing to have a different type of topic for this as well. I think I know you sort of made a comment on that it was sort of one of the less interesting ones, but I actually think it's been really, really interesting, and it's given us that opportunity to think about this, whereas I don't think often the opportunity doesn't arise to think about QAPL in this way. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Okay.